Look, I think it's an absolutely fantastic film, and I hope it gets a much wider audience than just here tonight and the other shows throughout Australia. However, I do think that we, the realists, need to focus on the fundamentals more than we have been doing. The fundamentals are the two propositions that the scam purveyors have. That's one, industrial man burning fossil fuels, creating greenhouse gases as the cause of global warming. Two. Proposition two, doing all these evil things, we're bringing about unprecedented rates of warming. Yeah. And the truth is that they're both lies. And we should just hammer and hammer and hammer at that. What you've done is fantastic. I do think that it needs to be hammered home that their two fundamental propositions are lies. In the last 800,000 years, the world's oceans have been going up and down between 105 and 130 metres on a 100,000 year cycle. Man had absolutely nothing to do with that. The average rate of rise of the world's oceans coming into this interglacial is over 5 times the current rate. So unprecedented rates of warming is another lie. Yes. So as much as anything is certain or settled in the debate, the only thing that really is settled is the two fundamental propositions that they have are lies. And we should push that and push it and push it.
Well, in the film, you actually saw the one red cube represented man-made CO2, and we show all the other cubes of the greenhouse effect in the atmosphere. What's fascinating about the whole debate is they're claiming that CO2 at 400 parts per million is unprecedented. And we show that we are currently in a CO2 famine when you look at the geologic history of the Earth. And you're absolutely right. We're in one of the 5 to 10% coldest periods in Earth's history. In other words, the Earth is rarely cold enough to support ice at both poles. So again, in the history of the Earth, we are at that point. So the idea that we're facing a climate warming catastrophe is not supported by the geologic evidence.
I just want to add one thing is that Mark and I go to a lot of these conferences. Occasionally we're booted out. But these UN conferences around the world, they hold them every year, and they don't hold them in Toledo, Akron. They hold them in posh places all over. I'm not sure they're into talking about the science ultimately. I don't know as though this is a scientific debate. While I do agree with the question in the sense that these points need to be hammered home, the people that are pushing this agenda, they're not about that. I've told this story but down in Melbourne and in Brisbane where we showed this before. A number of years ago, I had an opportunity to talk to a gentleman in the UN IPCC. And he told me, this is a guy who's from this Brazilian space agency, a high-ranking official. And I pretended to be a skeptic and asked him some of the stuff he saw in this film, you know, and surprisingly, as we were drinking a beer, he said to me, skeptics are right. And I said, what? And again, he thought I was on his side. I was asking him for help to help me argue back with him. He admitted that much of what you saw tonight is correct. He put his beer down, he took the coasters on a table and moved them around and said, this has nothing to do with the science. It's about moving the chips around. That was his comment to me. I only throw that out for you in answer to your question that I don't think this is entirely a scientific debate. And you'll see that, by the way, in movie number 2.
What's that? 2. Yes, go ahead.
I share everyone's congratulations to you about the movie. A suggestion, perhaps. Increased carbon dioxide levels have coincided over the last 50 years with a dramatic increase in crop production, yes. In the greening of the Sahara Desert and the Sub-Sahara Sahel. In fact, the planet is said by satellite observations to be something like 7 to 15% greener than it was, say, 50 years ago when satellites began. Now, surely that is an angle that is going to wedge, if you like, environmentalists, because nobody can complain about increased vegetation, which gives rise to increased animal life and increased crop production and the ability to feed humanity. What about that as an angle in your movie?
Yeah, yes, we do actually talk about that. One of the scientists, Leighton Stewart, is a geologist, says the Earth is getting greener and greener and greener. And then we have Michael Oppenheimer, who's a UN lead author who actually says anybody who eats is under threat from climate change. Well, I'm happy. How many does that exclude in here, by the way? What a ridiculous quote. But this is what they do. They'll acknowledge that CO2 has a fertilizing effect, but they'll say poison ivy will get worse. Mosquitoes will be worse. Insects will be worse. Anything you can think of that's a pest will be worse. That's the way they deal with it. Weeds will be worse. They just, it's as Craig said, this is an agenda. Margot, the former EU climate commissioner, a lady named Connie Hedegaard, said, even if we're wrong on the science, we're doing the right thing by policy. And Al Gore alluded to that the other day. It doesn't really matter whether we face a climate catastrophe. They're just using the catastrophe idea to sell their policies, to ram them with tipping points. We must act. They're not letting people have a debate. They're not letting people think about the merits of banning carbon-based energy and going to mandating so-called renewables, solar and wind, which a lot of people call unreliables. And that's what it boils down to. They don't want to argue about the merits of the policy. They want to scare you. They're using the climate scare to get a policy that they've already predetermined they want.
I only want to add to that there was an organization, and for those of us old to remember, that was called the Greening Earth Society. It was headed by ITSO back in the late 80s, early 90s. And they advocated that, the idea that CO2 was a good thing, and there was some work done by a guy named Sherwood Itso, his father, where he grew orange trees, and he did them in different levels of concentrations, and the ones that had more CO2 grew through the roof, and the ones that had regular ambient atmosphere were smaller. The Green reaction to that was not supportive. They attacked them terribly. They did not buy that particular argument at all. Again, as Mark just said, I think this has more to do with it gets in the way of their agenda. So I'm not sure that there is a silver bullet in just going with that particular argument.
Yeah. Other question? Yes, question.
Thanks again for all the efforts over the years. You might even want to quickly shake your hand.
Oh, thank you.
Well done. I suppose one thing I wanted to ask was the tendency for these the activists and the scientists that are involved in this to constantly shift their message. First it was global warming, then they claimed climate change. One of the more recent shifts I've encountered is the claim that the heating is all being trapped in the oceans.
Yes.
We've got ocean warming and we've got ocean acidification. Now, these are possibly more complicated issues to deal with than the greenhouse effect sort of thing, but I was just wondering, given that it wasn't really mentioned in the movie, if you have any thoughts on what the latest science is up to on those fronts and how you sort of deal with countering those arguments.
Yes, well, one of the things they argued when the global warming pause was alive and well from 1998 through the present, then we had a big El Nino in 2016. Well, they decided that before this global warming pause, I'll get to how they got rid of it in a second, but they said they came up with 60 excuses for why the temperatures weren't rising like they predicted, or why they weren't rising at all, actually, according to the satellite data. One of them was the oceans ate the global warming. It's kind of like the dog ate my homework. They said that the heat was hiding in the deep ocean. And meanwhile, scientists like who we featured in the film, one of them climatologist, Dr. Roger Pilkey Sr., others, couldn't find this alleged missing heat in the oceans. And a lot of scientists couldn't find it. So what ended up happening is they just announced 2 different studies. One was right before Paris. They wiped out the global warming pause in the surface data. The National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration just got rid of it. They said basically they went back and redid the books and wiped it out so that the global warming continued. The pause is now no longer in the record books. Just 2 weeks ago, they did the same thing in the satellite data. And you see in the film, Lord Monckton's referring to the satellite data. It's called the RSS, Remote Sensing System Satellite, set up by NASA. They got rid of the pause in that. They went back, redid the books. Now, wouldn't it be great if you had a company losing money for 20 years and you hired an accountant who said, guess what, I changed all the books, you're now making record profits. That's basically what they've done. And they've come up with all sorts of excuses. And because of the fact that sea level's not accelerating, extreme storms are not getting worse, they've tried to bring up ocean acidification. And scientists who are studying that, even recent reports on the Great Barrier Reef, all the exaggerations on the effect of corals, the oceans are not showing that kind of acidification that they're predicting, and it's just another way that they keep morphing their debate and strategy. No matter what happens, they used to talk about Mount Kilimanjaro for years, and it turned out Mount Kilimanjaro was losing snow, had nothing to do with climate. Multiple studies showed it. They finally stopped talking about that. They tried polar bears. Polar bear numbers are the highest ever recorded. So now you don't hear much about polar bears anymore. They just keep going with whatever they can to keep the campaign alive. This is essentially a partisan campaign, and the ClimateGate email showed us that. They're suppressing any studies, data, talking points that don't support them. They threaten journal editors if you publish scientists who don't toe the line.
Yeah. You were on a roll.
Okay, that's all. Any other questions? More questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Enjoyed the movie very much. Had a question. A few years back, the APS did a revision of their climate statement.
Yes, American Physical Society.
Yes.
Yes,
they did that excellent workshop at the. What happened with that? Has it done anything, and how can we influence or get people more involved in those scientific bodies so that that's where we can actually change things?
That's one of the things. Yeah, and we allude to this in the movie. Whether you're talking about the American Physical Society, the American Meteorological Society, the Canadian Royal Society, Australian scientific bodies, when they issue these, and this is one of the media loves this, the climate activists, how could all these scientists be wrong? The National Academy of Sciences, they've issued statements all agreeing with you, and are all these scientists lying? There's literally only maybe 1 dozen, up to 2 dozen governing board members who vote on these statements without a direct vote. Most of the members aren't even aware of the statements happening, and they issue the statements in line. There's been a lot of blowback. American Meteorological Society, the rank and file scientists, one study a few years back showed up to 75% were skeptical of the climate claims. The American Physical Society was led by Richard Lindzen and Will Happer, who, by the way, Princeton physicist Dr. Will Happer is a leading contender to replace, to come in as President Trump's science czar. He's the man in the film who said CO2 is currently in a geological famine. That would probably be the single greatest game-changing event in communicating climate science to the world if the United States climate science czar was Dr. Will Happer. So that's something we can all hope for, because he would be an outspoken climate skeptic in the highest level position you can be in the United States. But yeah, there's a whole revolt among members. They went back and forth. I believe they had some changes, but I'd have to look up the exact wording. They had an influence. There was initially rejected. They kept coming back, the skeptical members of the American Physical Society. That's one way you can fight this, but that's not something that... I think the biggest way to fight it is to allow more and more scientists just to speak out and not be intimidated. Unfortunately, young scientists are intimidated. You'll notice a lot of the scientists in the film were older. A lady named Joanne Simpson, the first woman PhD meteorologist in the world, or at least in the United States, was a big NASA scientist. She's deceased now, but a few years ago. But she didn't speak out until after she retired and left NASA. When she was over 80 years old, she said, her quote was, "Now that I'm retired, I can speak frankly. I'm a skeptic of global warming." This is a woman who overcame imagine being the first woman PhD meteorologist, and she couldn't declare her skepticism until she resigned. That is a powerful force that keeps these scientists silent and going along, towing the line.
Yeah, Mark said it well. I say one of the things is, and I noticed we had our Giavar say it, he resigned, and that's not helpful. We got to keep our people that are on our side in these societies speaking out. There's been efforts by Dr. Fred Singer in the past to try to change them that were unsuccessful. So much of it, and we got to look into this, is funding driven, and it would be curious to see how many of these outfits are receiving some funding of some sort. And that is one way to do it. I'm not 100% sure that the societies that Mark just named are the way to go. There are other ones coming from Eastern Europe and other places that might be ones that are refuge for skeptics, as they are more bold. I mean, they fought the communists, so to them the Greens are kind of wimpy. So they're able to have the backbone to stand up to these things. But there's a lot of social pressure that we hear from them. The important thing to note is, as Tom Harris said, no official polls have been done. I always like to say, whenever you get all these scientists together and they say everybody's in lockstep, the only place I've seen lockstep like that is maybe in Chavez's, Venezuela or Castro's Cuba. You know, that's the only time you can get 97% to agree on everything. Interestingly, on our side, where the real debate is, on the skeptics, you will find wide diversity of opinion on so many different issues, even on what's causing the global warming, if there is a modest amount. Is it the Pacific Oscillation? Is it sunspot activity? That's real science. And you know, we do get together through the Heartland Institute and have an annual meeting, but I do think something has to be done to get our scientists peer-reviewed and where it doesn't threaten their career when they have the guts to stand out against the establishment.
Yeah, and by the way, Dr. Robert Giegengak, who was in the film, actually said you can compare the economics profession to the climate science profession, and you know economists are more honest and open. And the example he gave was you put 100 economists in a room, and they're all going to fight like cats and dogs about every aspect of economics. But he said the claim that you somehow put 100 climate scientists in a room and all of them are going to agree in lockstep, that doesn't smell right. Another question here.
Thank you for your presentation tonight. It was fantastic. But I have a problem that the Education Department and the do-gooders about this climate change, they brainwash our children and our grandchildren. We try to tell them that this is not happening, and they don't want to listen to us because the teacher knows and the teacher's told them that the climate change is happening and the world is doomed. And then they talk about fossil fuel, and then we should have this carbon tax, and everyone should pay for these wind turbines and everything else to make it healthier and a more cleaner world. I think that we've got to get, I don't know, scientists or people like you to change the education department and change the thinking that we're brainwashing the children.
Well, they know that you can go after kids, and that's actually going to be in our next film. From kindergarten, from first grade, all the way through college, these kids are hit with what Patrick Moore basically said Greenpeace does, that humans are parasites on the planet, that all of our modern energy is destroying the planet, and they're taught that solar and wind are some kind of virtuous model. And it's people, they only look at the problems of fossil fuels and they only look at the ideal of renewables. They don't look at the reality of renewables. And renewables have many issues in terms of whether you're talking about being bird blenders or you're talking about how the solar cells are made, or you know, in our own Mojave Desert in California, there was a lawsuit by the Greens saying that I guess it was the solar panels were affecting the habitat of the endangered desert tortoise, which, by the way, isn't really even endangered. It's only regionally endangered. It's at the edge of its habitat. At the edge of any animal's habitat, they figured out, hey, we can declare that animal regionally endangered because there's not that many of them. Well, it's the edge of their natural habitat. But anyway, they're suing over that. There was a lawsuit years ago on that. So there's so many different issues with any kind of energy. The idea that one energy is a panacea is just nonsense. But we do know, and Al Gore admitted this in his talk in Melbourne, fossil fuels are over 80% of the world's energy. And by the way, you can go back 100 years, guess what? Fossil fuels were over 80% of the world's energy. And he said that they've helped lift people out of poverty, and they've been incredible to humanity. But he basically says the time is over for them. And the problem with that is you don't mandate an energy that works for a promise of something. You don't ban an energy that works for the promise and mandate of something new. And that's where you get into the United Nations, global governance mentioned, central planning. This is what Václav Klaus, the former Czech president, said, since the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc communist nations, the greatest threat to individual liberty comes from what he considers the climate agenda. That's what we're facing. They're coming after us in terms of our liberties, our sovereignty, our rights. The UN climate chief has actually said we're going to make life on planet Earth a radical transformation, is what she's actually called. Christina Figueres has actually called for that.
I was just going to add to that we are very active at CFACT in trying to change the education system. We have a number of different programs. We have a collegians program in the United States. Mark and I will actually be talking to a lot of student leaders on the college level and have been active on that for quite some time. On the for the younger schools in the United States, it's a little bit different than perhaps here, but perhaps one thing that you have in common is that the teachers aren't sympathetic to this necessarily. I had the opportunity to address a lot of them a little while back, and I remember I was trying to say some things that were not so pleasant about Al Gore. And one of the things in one of his book, he gave praise to the earth goddess, who is assumed to be the fount of all life. That's actually from his book, An Inconvenient Truth. And we thought that was a little wacky. They didn't. They stood up and gave it an applause. And I said, wow, they're applauding the earth goddess. These people, a lot in the education establishment, are hook, line, and sinker. You remember in this movie that guy in the before the polar bear, where he said that I like to tell my students, all smart scientists agree with global warming. It was a little passing thing, but he was a teacher. Trying to crack through that is tough. We did succeed in one state, West Virginia. Mark and I went down there with some college students, argued with the State Board of Regents, and now in that state, you're allowed to teach both sides. Florida just recently passed a law. Thank you. Yes.
It's decentralized in the US. So yeah.
Florida just recently passed a law that parents can complain about it if it's being taught. This is just within the last month, and can raise objection to what they're being taught in schools. And I guess in England, Lord Monckton and others have actually said when An Inconvenient Truth is shown that you actually have to show the errors in that film, or at least a few of them. This is a long battle. But we think that's where the future is, actually, is taking it on in the schools. We were hoping to do an assessment in the United States. We'd love to do something down here in Australia. It's a great country. And we want to try and figure out exactly how to crack the school system and get it into the standards of learning that they hear both sides.
Any other questions?
Thank you. What a fantastic movie. Fantastic. Absolutely welcome to Australia.
Thank you very much.
I had the good fortune of having a niece that moved to California earlier, about 15 years ago, and I went over there and was riding my Harley around. And I was chatting to a couple of guys at a bar, and they said, Australia, it must be the last frontier. And I said, you are kidding, this is a nanny state. My name's Larry Mouser. I'm a HSC physics teacher. I've had my job threatened by daring to suggest on my Facebook page that global warming is not true. I was first published in the Sydney Morning Herald in 1999, suggesting global warming wasn't true. The day after the CSIRO came out with a huge page in the letters page decrying me as mischievous, I really pulled my head in. I thought, yikes. And I thought, no. So I answered their letter and waited for the next bombshell. The next day, there was a small letter from Edmund Potter, ex-head research scientist at the CSIRO, who said, I did the right thing, Larry Mouser, by sticking my neck out, and heard nothing else. Then I continued to write for the Sydney Morning Herald, and then a few years ago, they publicly, the letters editors announced, we will no longer produce anything that questions global warming. I've researched this for many years. I just thought, yep, ticked off the boxes. Are you aware that Arrhenius was the first guy, this Nobel laureate chemist, Arrhenius in the 1800s, came up with it, and he said it'd be great for the planet. So I was waiting for that to come up, but I didn't.
Yes, that was 19th century, the original father of the greenhouse gas theory. In fact, he actually did not think it was going to be catastrophic. And there's a couple of some conflicting 19th century articles and stuff, quotations from him. But what people have done is said, okay, if there's a greenhouse effect, therefore it's catastrophic. But the whole point of the film is we're showing that it's overwhelmed. You cannot finger CO2 as the control knob of the climate. And that, you mentioned the papers not publishing you. The LA Times, the Los Angeles Times in America will not even publish letters to the editor skeptical now. They won't even acknowledge this is a organized, ideological, partisan campaign to suppress any dissent. It is unprecedented, at least in modern times in science. But as we mentioned in the film, you had very similar things with eugenics and with other past alleged consensuses. And it's just a shame that this is where this whole debate has gone. But it all changed in 1988. And when I say that is, when the United Nations got involved, organization money, the UN basically said, we're going to look at how CO2 impacts the climate. They had no reason or incentive to ever say CO2 doesn't impact the climate, because the UN, not only were they tasked with looking at CO2, they were tasked with coming up with the solution. And the head of the climate panel, Rajendra Pachauri, who just resigned after a sex scandal a few years ago, said, quote, "Global warming is my religion," unquote. Now, what other scientific issue would the head of the panel that's in charge of studying the scientific issue announce that that scientific issue was his religion? That's how insane it's become.
Yeah, so I don't know if I was clear. The Sydney Morning Herald's letters page editors said we will no longer publish letters that question global warming.
And that's also the case in the United States. We have the LA Times, we have several newspapers in the US, but you know, I was going to, well, two exceptions to your thing. Number one is you said you were in the United States, you were in California. California is not the United States. That's number one.
They agree.
Yeah. But I do agree with you about the nanny state in Australia. It did surprise me. I mean, I've always thought of Paul Hogan, you know, what's that, Crocodile Dundee? That was always my vision of it to a large degree. And I got a rude awakening when I went to Melbourne on this particular trip, and I took out some bicycles. Yeah, I was being eco-friendly for a moment. And I wanted to get around town. And I remember getting on the bicycle, and we had one of our other staff persons, Debbie, we were biking through town and everything, and somebody came up to us and told us, "You guys got to put on a helmet." I said, "A helmet? Who rides with a..." I never rode, we didn't ride with a helmet, but we didn't get fined either, so we were happy about that. But we go to a lot of these different UN meetings around the world, and let me say, there's still that spirit here in Australia. One of the reasons I was excited about coming here is when I'm down at these UN conferences, it's very depressing. But the people who do have the chutzpah, I would say South Africans got it, Americans got it, Canadians to a degree, but Australians? Oh my gosh. I was in Bali, Indonesia a decade ago, and I got my first taste of an Australian who has it, Joanne Nova. You know her? Oh yeah. Her and her husband, Dave Evans, I remember we pulled off a little stunt. Al Gore had just won his Nobel Prize and was coming into Bali to be coronated at a UN conference. And we snuck in there. We got a bunch of peer reviewers, and we put out a big banner saying no Kyoto 2, and it caused a big hoopla. But she was gutsy, and she still is. She flew to our back to our meeting here. So I don't know as though Australia deep down inside doesn't have something there. So we're excited about it. We hope to be back and show this film and our follow-up film, more importantly, certainly when it comes out next year. So, we like Australia.
G'day, my name is Jason Linney, and one thing that really came to my mind towards the end was all these things that have been happening for the past 31 years of my life. I've been looking at it in reflection, and looking at this film is the question of crimes against humanity. Really. I mean, like, how many people have been affected by these things and have not realized? You know, we're talking like food supply here. We're talking like a whole range of things that is really deep and quite concerning for all of humanity, right? It's like when they were talking about, in the video, you're talking about a shared prosperity, you know? We're talking like global government here. As George Bush or one of you guys put it, New World Order, that's right. What are your thoughts on these things? And what are your thoughts on automation and, you know, these sort of tools?
Well, the agenda is very clear. We have the German climate advisor Hans Schulenhuber, who actually is now advising Pope Francis. And as a Catholic, that's just a whole other nightmare thing to talk about, Pope Francis. Yes. But he actually called for, this German climate advisor called for a CO2 budget for every man, woman, and child on the planet from, and here's the two cities he picked, Berlin to Beijing, which I thought were two interesting cities with a big history of central planning. And then you have carbon ration cards have been proposed, you know, where the employers would monitor your train travel, your airline travel, your home energy use. Control of thermostats has been proposed in California and other places. this is all about, again, if you go back to the 1960s, we alluded to Paul Ehrlich, the overpopulation bomb, which, by the way, the new scare is underpopulation, as the population is going to stabilize and go down. Paul Ehrlich and all the other eco-scares since then have all had one thing in common. The solution has always been to shut down free men and free women and have bureaucrats in essentially central planning control every aspect of the lives because they know better, because basically they think humans left to freedom will destroy the planet. And so they're using the climate scare, it's the latest environmental scare they're using in order to push this agenda of central planning, global governance. The irony of this is Al Gore is a white, wealthy, Western politician talking about, quote, fertility management, you saw there. And then what does he say next? He starts talking about how many Africans there are projected to be in the world. And we all know that as countries get wealthier and develop, the birth rate stabilize and then drop. Well, Al Gore is literally saying in that film that there's going to be projected to be too many people of color in the world, and we need fertility management. What politician other than Al Gore could get away with lamenting that there's going to be too many people of color in Africa? This is where it gets more chilling when you think about that agenda, and they're denying them life-saving energy. Solar panels on huts made of dung is not the solution to the developing world's poverty.
Amen. Amen.
One thing that Mark and I did stop at one of their crazy plans they had, it was in Durban, South Africa a few years ago. We were monitoring that particular conference, and I remember we were with Christopher Monckton at that time. We had actually parachuted in and made the front page of their paper. I don't know if you've ever heard that, but that's an interesting story on its own. Last night of the particular conference, Christopher, who was out looking at the various things, and I were discussing what we should report on. And he was telling me a bunch of things that were scientific that I was somewhat following. And I was about to tune out because I had to fly back the next day. And the next thing he said is number 5 or 6 on his list. Oh yeah, and the UN is proposing a world climate court and giving rights to Mother Nature. And I kind of said, hold the press. He just blew him off. And I said, hold that thought. I went down the hall, knocked on the door, woke Mark up. He was sleeping. And I said, Mark, rights, World Climate Court, rights to Mother Nature. And he goes, I'm on it. Immediately, he jumped on it, got the press out there, and the UN had in the actual document, which was a precursor to this Paris Agreement, that they would establish such a thing. But because of Mark's great work in getting it out there, and then Chris's as well, Monckton's, Lord Monckton's, that was actually pulled from the language and stopped. But that's kind of crazy when you think about it, that they actually are contemplating, and they've never really lost that in the ongoing developments, that they want to actually, far from being crimes against humanity, like our questioner we're talking about, they're more worried about what crimes you're committing against Mother Earth. And they want to establish a court to actually judge nations and people if you're violating your carbon output, or maybe some of you are carbon criminals and you don't know about it yet. So this is the type of thinking that goes on there, and yes, it is dangerous. What do we think about the New World Order and that sort of thing? We're against it.
There you go. Next question.
Hi, thank you again for today. My question is, NASA get their funding from space exploration, so why are they backing the climate hustle?
Great question. In fact, I was just thinking that Professor Brian Cox, you all remember his debate with Senator Malcolm Roberts. One of the key moments, that it was a stand-up and cheer moment for the climate activists. Brian Cox said, this is a chart from NASA. The same agency that put men on the moon. Therefore, we can't question NASA. Yes, you can. You know why? And this is something that we'll have a little bit more of in the sequel. The actual scientists and engineers who put men on the moon have condemned NASA for their outrageous climate alarmism under James Hansen, the former director, and now the current director is Gavin Schmidt. So the answer, Brian Cox's simple question is, this is not from the same people who put man on the moon, because the people who put man on the moon formed a coalition called The Right Stuff, and there's maybe over 100 of these scientists now condemning the current NASA's promotion of climate alarm. And this includes, you have Al Gore in the film saying, the people who think the moon landing was staged are the same ones who don't believe global warming. almost all the moonwalkers, and every moonwalker I'm aware of, Harrison Smith and others, have all declared themselves global warming skeptics. So it is, to answer your question, it's been hijacked. The guy who used to head NASA had been arrested 6 times or more protesting global warming, actually been in handcuffs. The lead scientist at NASA was arrested protesting global warming, and he endorsed a book calling for ridding the world of industrial civilization. It was a hardcore ideologue at NASA in charge of the temperature database.
Jim, we don't have any more questions, right? I did want to say one final thing here. We are coming out with another movie next year called Climate Monarchy, which you saw, and you saw a preview of that.